Amanda Van Dyke, at Arch, we manage a private equity critical minerals strategy that does exactly what it says. We only invest in critical minerals, and we invest largely in public companies, even with a sort of long-term private equity holding strategy, investing in a combination of sort of cornerstone stakes and small royalties.
Cormac, MD of Electrios Energy in Hong Kong. We provide consulting services on the EV and battery industry, from mining rocks to building battery packs to put in the EVs, the whole supply chain, and of course policy as well.
Great, nice to meet you. Rob Baylis from InnoEnergy. We're currently investing into early stage startups in the energy transition area, so anything from hydrogen right the way through to e-mobility and circularity. And one of those areas also is the battery value chain. So we have about 30 investments across the value chain, from raw materials through to recycling. And now we're launching a new fund focused more on evaluation phase, demonstration phase projects, particularly those in Europe that are seeking to fill the current very large gap in the upstream value chain today. And we are partnered with Dimiter, which is a French venture and infrastructure fund on that particular project. We're currently in the marketing phase, building the pipeline of opportunities, and looking to get going with capital deployment probably from 2025.
All right, great. So, to kick off the panel, I thought we could kind of take a backwards look before we take a forwards look. So, one of obviously the biggest policy that's come out regarding critical minerals has been the IRA in the US. So maybe we could talk about a few lessons learned from kind of this launch, and where do you think it's driven the most change, both in the US and globally? And is it enough to meet the current industry needs in terms of metals exploration and all of that? So whoever wants to start us off here.
I can jump in. I actually just got back late last night from a roundtable with the Department of Energy in the US and a number of other actors, including Vale and Rio Tinto, on decarbonizing critical mineral supply chains. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that there isn't a sufficient supply chain of next generation critical minerals and chemicals, because critical minerals for the battery supply chain are largely high purity chemicals, not the actual mineral itself. And what was very interesting is that the players that were there, including some OEMs, and they all want the critical minerals, but what's really missing and what they're searching for is a way to get the risk capital into the first stages. Because right now, with the IRA and the DOE, if you can demonstrate that you have a sustainable plan for building your project and you can get it into Western markets, there's definitely debt financing available, guaranteed with export guarantees from both the European Union and the US. The issue is sufficiently de-risking the projects with things like demonstration plants and the risk capital required to get it there. I think that's what, and that's where they're struggling to find someone to get the projects to the point where they are financeable. I think a lot of things are being looked at. One of the interesting things, and I don't know, given you guys are more on the upstream or the downstream end of it, the frustrations I'm hearing from a lot of people are that the OEMs are really having trouble. They're not signing the offtakes because they don't really know the spec they need, which makes it difficult for the upstream guys as well as the downstream guys, because you can't really get a project ahead until you know exactly what spec you need to build it to, or the chemical to.
Yeah. I was just thinking this morning, the IRA is almost 2 years old. In August will be 2 years old, and really we've seen very little development in terms of critical minerals coming from the US primarily, or North America, coming onto the market anytime soon. So As you asked, what lessons learned? I think there's a lot of lessons to learn here, particularly for the UK, which still has to really set their policy out in terms of really securing materials, and Europe to a certain extent. That a few things have worked in the IRA and a few other things haven't. Big problem with the OEMs is they don't know what they need. In some cases, they don't want to know because I often interact with the OEMs in the US in terms of supplying raw materials, and their most common answer is, our battery maker deals with that. You talk to the battery makers, they'll say our cam maker deals with that, and then you go down the chain. So nobody will tell you what spec they want, because they don't know really, because the specs are constantly changing. But we're seeing like the investments they've made in the IRA have basically been with a lot of startups who have no experience in industry, and they're suffering those kind of problems. A runway for a startup which is producing graphite, producing nickel sulfate. We need some larger players, and you mentioned a few of them. I think Vale, maybe even Glencore or others, Rio Tinto, to really put serious capital into producing battery-grade metals or chemicals, mostly chemicals. And I think the US has an appetite for that. It'd be less so here, I think, because it requires a lot of investment and it's highly risk. Unless you have the US government backing up in some of those investments, they're very risky, especially with the kind of new players stepping into the space. So I think risk is I agree with you. Risk is a big issue right now. Who you put your money into?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And I think one thing you've noticed with the IRA is that, particularly for the grant funding, it has gone to projects that you would say maybe either industrialization of technology that's coming from elsewhere. So saying, okay, you can set up this plant, but it's just a blueprint of somebody else's established technology, or it's very new technology that needs some grant funding to sort of move it along and help with private finance. But of course, what you haven't seen so much is an update of those projects on how they've actually been coping with raising the private capital to be able to unlock the grant funding. So that's one side of it. I think also very little of that capital has gone to upstream, particularly for the mining side. And I think one reason for that is the controversy around mining. Politically, it's not a very good industry to fund because often that mining side comes with a lot of social pushback. And it's the same in Canada, it's the same in Europe. You see the policy and the funding not going to the sort of very start of the value chain in terms of those sort of projects. So I don't think the IRA is in isolation is necessarily the only one that has its faults in that area. And in the same time, both for Canada and Europe, a lot of the capital has been more readily available to midstream and downstream projects that have largely been sort of industrialization efforts of existing technology, I would say. And the question is, now with potential change in sort of presidency, what will happen to that? Will it sort of stall? Will there be some sort of renewed efforts to get moving on the mining side? But as you say, I think when you get project to sort of de-risking phase, there is capital available. Same in Europe. If you can get to FID and your project has been well developed, then yes, you can get funding. I suppose markets and economics sort of aside whether that is a investable opportunity. But
I was just jumping in there. I've spent a lot of time in Washington lately. And in Brussels with the Critical Raw Materials Act. And what I've seen is that you're very correct. Really, that funding is only available to projects who are at FID. And for anything battery chemicals related in the critical mineral supply chain, you need a demonstration plant. You need a proof of concept. Nobody's willing to invest in new technology. And the only people actually ready and capable of signing offtakes are still the Chinese, who have the only commercialized technology for building that battery supply chain. Well, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans are included in there, but it's definitely coming from Asia. If you actually look at the offtake agreements that are coming from Western OEMs, they're very loosely worded MOUs, to be perfectly honest, because they don't know what spec they need. So if you want access to funding out of Europe or Washington, you really need to be at FID on a fully de-risked project. And there's still a dearth of risk capital, as I see it, and sort of knowledgeable risk capital to invest in the development stage guys to get them ready for that. I mean, it's partially what we do, but we wish we weren't some of the only guys doing it. On the subject you brought up, it's actually, there's a silver lining to all this. One of the only subjects both parties seem to agree on that has bipartisan support in the US is that redomiciling manufacturing, combating China's industrial strength and developing an internal critical minerals strategy and financing it is very important to the future of US industry. So I think you can be, I don't know if they'll still call it the IRA should the administration change, but I think that one way or another the support for it will be there. But you kind of hit the nail on the head. While the government might be supporting it and the policies might be supporting it, the generalist investing that makes something truly work, the money flows into it, are still not there. American investors, in my experience, and European investors, they're much more comfortable. They're comfortable in the downstream. The upstream and mining still scare the crap out of them. Mm-hmm. Excuse my French.
Yeah, exactly. And I think on your point that, one of the key drivers for us launching this new fund was to address that shortfall of capital for the sort of phase of development. So, yeah, we see, venture going in early. That's a tough market today, but it's still out there. And you said, when projects get to FID or, TRL 9 level, they can be funded, and that there's debt available, there's strategic equity, there's capital out there. But it's this bit in the middle that is really struggling. And we've seen some national efforts in Europe, for example, to fund some of those projects now, which is good. But, private side, it's still lacking. And that's the area we kind of looked at. InnoEnergy is very focused on very early stage, pre-seed, seed stage companies. And yeah, then, someone like Dimitar, who's our partner, is sort of there, but also with infrastructure end of it. But in the middle, right, you map it out and you say, who's operating in the middle of that space? Very few people. And despite the tailwinds of the IRA, the other, US policy, the loan programs, now the Section 302 import duties, European Critical Raw Materials Act, Net Zero Industry Act, they're all political and, somewhat semi-quasi or full financial tools, but yeah, not in the space where things are needed to get moving.
You were talking about demonstration plants. When's the last time you heard a Chinese company building a demonstration plant or a pilot line? They don't do it, right? They just build a plant.
Well, to be fair, though, and this is something that I think is a real problem with the narrative in our space. China, 20 years ago, started investing in critical mineral battery and full battery supply chains. And 70% of the world's batteries are still made there. And they own the offtakes and they mine it. They own the offtakes, they own the chemicals, and all of the cathode and anode materials. They get it. They don't need to necessarily build a pilot plant or I've actually seen companies build pilot plants in China for using like DLE technology and stuff like that. But the point is they have it already, so they know it works. They can just test the material in their existing plant. But if you want to build a plant, the only way you get Western funding is if you're willing to build some part of the plant outside of China, right? It has to be less than 25 or 30% owned by a Chinese entity. It's quite protectionist, and the Chinese are willing to license their technology because they have it and it's commercialized and it works, right? So that's why you don't need a demonstration plant. But if you want to, I understand it. If you want to get, hundreds of millions of dollars to build something on new technology, you need to know it works before you do it.
Yeah.
And the reason the Chinese don't do it is because they've already done it.
Yeah.
They've commercialized the tech.
Under our time frame, we don't really need. There's like 100 different DLE projects, always going to demonstration phase. Like, as you said, the technology is already out there. More on the spodumene side for carbonates, but it's cookie cutter at this stage if you're willing to work with the Chinese. Other than that, you're financing a lot of companies who are.
We tend to
developing different tech.
support, I mean, it's obviously case by case, but partnering with the Chinese and their experience is just smart business. You have to be careful, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I think from an investment perspective, from our perspective, investing in guys who have commercialized this and done it for 20 years, execution risk is everything in the mining sector. And that is the safer bet than experimenting with new technology. And the Chinese are quite commercial. They know that the trade war is hotting up. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And so the companies want to maintain their ability to sell to Western markets are happy to consider building plants outside of China and partnering with either downstream US or European or US or upstream around the world. At least that's our experience in the companies that we're looking at investing in.
Yeah, they don't typically go out anywhere. They partner locally everywhere they go, usually.
Look, from my perspective, mining's risky enough.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we're not alone in not loving technology risk or execution.
Yeah.
I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Sorry.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Just looking at the two sides of the Atlantic, who decides which are the critical minerals? I mean, I've seen the Americans put money into a nickel project in Africa, for example, and yet nickel seems to be in pretty abundant supply right now. And I'm not even sure if it's on the European list of critical metals. And graphite, we've seen the Americans put some money into. I don't know if we've seen European money go in. I mean, is there actually a defined list on both sides of the Atlantic, and presumably separate defined lists where the Americans have nickel on there, I guess? And then the final part of the question is uranium getting onto anybody's list at the moment?
No. So there's 68 minerals on the US list. It's quite extensive, and there's 28 minerals with another smaller list of strategic minerals on the European list. They've all published official lists of what is critical to them, which means a supply chain at risk. But prioritization on that list, I mean, there's a lot of tiny little things like cesium on it. Prioritization in that list in terms of what they really, really need. They're still politicians, right? They get given a list by USGS of what is critical, which supply chains does the US need, either for technology or for their industry, that they don't control or have sufficient control over their supply chain on. Natural graphite being a high risk one, tungsten's on it. But the politicians
and yet
who are
tungsten as another good example, like nickel, of something which has been in the doldrums for quite some time. I mean, so why is tungsten so critical?
It's critical because they don't have direct access to it in the US. It's on their list because 100%, not quite right, but close to 100% of tungsten used in US industry is imported. And if you look at the global supply of tungsten, the offtake agreements are sitting with China. So China controls those supply chains. So the risk is, will America continue to be able to get the tungsten they need for their industry? It has nothing to do with whether or not tungsten is sufficiently supplied. All of the information I've seen from Wood Mackenzie and Macquarie is that the nickel market is in oversupply until at least 2027, probably till 2030. And in terms of my priorities, nickel's not on my list, right?
I agree. I mean, it's very hard to see what the incentive is for a domestic producer. I mean, we've got a significant stake in an American-based nickel company, but hey, I mean, if the pricing remains bad, it's not a great investment to be in, whether somebody thinks it's a critical metal or not. And so actually the list on the one hand is kind of interesting, and it's helpful if you can get some sort of government money for early stage development, obviously, but it doesn't really provide any help with the economics at the end of the day. It's all market-led economics. It's not.
I think you have to look at.
It's not like they're going to pay a premium for domestically produced tungsten. There's no talk of that, is there?
There's a really big misnomer and misunderstanding in the market. The idea that it's critical kind of infers that it's in short supply or available, or that there's a short to medium term supply shortage. And that's not actually how critical minerals are defined. Critical minerals are defined simply by, do we need it for our industry, and do we have access to it? Or do we control access to it? So as we mentioned, tungsten and nickel are in great supply, just America doesn't control enough of that supply, which is why it's on their critical minerals list. It has nothing, like, it's simply, it's really about risk to supply chains for who, it's very, critical minerals lists are very jurisdictionally located. Unfortunately, the guys who are in charge of doling out the money don't necessarily prioritize. They're like, oh, it's on a list, we can give you money, even if the economics of the actual project are really bad, to be perfectly honest. It's not something any of us would invest in.
No. And I think the other side of it is that when you look at the critical materials, that you're not going to see any incentives that directly provide a premium that makes projects in certain countries where that material is needed economic. I guess what you see is other policies that incentivize that asset, that either, for example, provides low-cost capital, or where there are some protectionist measures on the industry that benefits the value chain and therefore, can absorb a sort of higher cost operation.
There could be a premium on it. Like in Europe, there's going to be the domestic supply of nickel. Will have to end up in the batteries.
Yeah.
Starting in 2027, and
that has to be proven to be domestic nickel, does it?
Well, you could, domestically European extracted.
Okay.
So I guess one good example is something like magnesium. So in the US has a high import duty on magnesium imports, which supports the only US magnesium as the only US producer of magnesium metal, because that metal was seen as being strategic to the military use, and generally industry wasn't as concerned with the high sort of premium, but that's a kind of rare case. The question is now these new tariffs that were introduced only yesterday by the US government on certain materials for critical industry, in particular the battery value chain and the vehicle industry.
I didn't see that. So they're replicating what they've got on magnesium on some other.
Yes.
Are they?
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose ultimately what happens is the consumer, us, we lose out because it makes the cost of the goods more expensive because you haven't got it.
But nickel's a funny one though. If Indonesian nickel is going to be on that list or not allowed into the US for the Chinese Association, nickel market will. If it's non-Indonesian nickel, plus what's going on in Russia, it could have a deficit again.
But what are they going to do? Are you going to get a bifurcated market where Indonesian and Russian nickel is excluded and they pay a premium for American nickel?
There's an indirect to that as well. So their nickel is still like 80% used by the stainless steel industry. And they can ban taking it from Indonesia. I don't think they're going to do it from Indonesia, actually, but I think they are. But the reality is the Chinese built all those plants or funded all those plants, so all of that offtake is going to China. But between 40% in Indonesia and at least 20% in Russia, 60% of the world's nickel supply is via China, but it goes directly into their batteries, and their stainless steel are then sold as end products. So you can ban nickel, it doesn't matter. What they're actually selling to America and the world is the stainless steel and the batteries that already have the nickel in them.
Yeah, if those batteries can get into the country now, but the stainless steel got a tariff as well, 100%.
And are they going to ease permitting? Like if you want American production of stuff, a little bit of help on the permitting side might be a good way of getting production too.
Sorry, I'm just, there's a real, I've seen this in Europe and in America. As I said, the policymakers have realized how important domestic supply chains that lead to the West and domestic production is. But, and I put a huge caveat, they still, and they've tried to streamline processes and this and that, but local opposition, social opposition in both Europe and North America to mining projects is still incredibly high. So even though you have federal support and federal money, the permitting, I saw some recent research by Capital IQ, the average time to develop a nickel project right now globally is 16 to 18 years, right? That's for any of the Canadian projects or anything like that. And that's 16 to 18 years is the average, not including the fact that, they got everything up in Indonesia in less than 8, right? So they've averaged it. It's probably 20 years to get a Western project going. And everyone keeps saying Canada's a friendly mining jurisdiction.
Right? And the EU, through the Critical Raw Materials Act, introduced this fast-track permitting process. So it doesn't skip any of the requirements in terms of what you have to do to get your permits, but it almost puts you at the top of the list to get sort of priority treatment in terms of the government resource to get those projects going. The problem is, especially in Europe, I don't know about the US, is that there is still the opportunity for people to effectively take that to court to challenge it. So it doesn't override still the ability for those projects to get caught up in.
So in
such cases.
I helped consult on the development of the Critical Raw Materials Act, and it does exactly what you say. So they basically have gone to, they've passed it at the European level, but forcing it on European member states is a lot easier said than done. And they basically said, you have, 6 months, 1 year to approve a project and review a project. Because it used to happen is they were just stuck in permitting, in the local permitting process forever. And so there's this European imposed, because of the criticality, time frame for which they have to get through the stages in the process. But it's still like 5 years long. It's still 2 to 5 years long, depending on what stage the project's at. And individual communities block it and take it to court. They fight it because they just don't want mining in their backyard.
But okay, but why is the industry not getting the eco-green groups educated in the necessity of mining development? To get a green transition, the mining sector has to go ahead. Why aren't you guys just bombarding the communities and saying you've got to be on our side?
Yeah, and that's starting to happen now. I think you see a lot of more education-driven sort of outreach by the companies, by the governments to say, look, if you want a green transition, then you have to, have mining. You can't just replace oil and gas with nothing. But, what would you rather have? Would you rather have, high CO2, bad environments, or would you want to mine somewhere up the road in your back garden that, can be CO2 free and generates industry? And that's a huge challenge anywhere to kind of move people's sort of opinion, because it's.
So I was with the COP guys at this retreat thing I was at for the last 2 days, and the Just Transition guys and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and it was all about how to decarbonize mining supply chains. And the understanding for the high-level green movement and at the government level that critical minerals are absolutely essential to the energy transition is there. But the actual green groups, as we would call them, are extremely local, and their anti-mining sentiment is irrational, and they have incredible pull with local governments. So the high-level understanding is there, but don't ever doubt the ability of a local community that's highly motivated to stop mining in their own backyard, especially in Europe and North America.
Yeah, that's why they're developing new tech, like DLE with Vulcan Resources. They could be producing lithium in your backyard and you'll never know, because it's extracting brines, pumping them back in, a very small footprint. Big attitude, and that's why it might be a big problem for the energy transition is not in our backyard. And for years, it's been done, all the extraction's done elsewhere, and people in Europe and US are kind of happy with that.
Personally, I mean, I have some real doubts about European projects just because and even American projects, just because time is money, and the delays and time in the permitting and development process make the returns quite, like they're a significant costly risk. Like an extra year or two on the development, or 3 years because of random delays, can really affect your investment returns. But as a rule of thumb, my opinion, you're welcome to disagree with me, I would never invest in an open pit. I would only ever invest in Europe in something that was underground, because anything with an open footprint, I do not believe it'll get permitted. Not in Europe, in my opinion.
Unless it's somewhere that's, brownfield more accepted. And I think that's what you see, particularly in the Nordics. There is more scope for that.
Credit where
yes,
credit's due.
I think
Northern
if you try and do it
Scandinavia
somewhere-
is pretty decent in understanding. They have a long history of mining, and Spain is also not as bad. But in Germany, it's only something like Vulcan that's pure underground that I think is going to work.
Yeah, you're right.
And some of their lithium projects and stuff like that.
Can I ask one other question? What new technologies are coming along that's going to disrupt existing technologies, in your opinion? Second battery technology.
Well, I mean, that's I guess that's a pretty uncertain sort of forecast in terms of what might sort of disrupt the kind of current status quo. I think the more interesting aspect is, on this case, on the mining side, what is going to change the way that materials are extracted from the ground. And we see a lot of innovative technology in that area, but the question is how much of it is practical. For example, you see DLE, you see in situ uranium extraction. I think they're now looking for it for copper. I'm not so familiar with some of the other sort of metals. Does it work on things like tungsten or graphite? Probably not. So the difficulty is, can you naturally shift conventional mining practices in terms of their physical impact where the deposit is? I think that's going to be pretty tough. I guess where you see developments, which is largely, I think, driven by decarbonisation of the downstream side, is towards sort of processes and products that are less carbon intensive to produce. And there's a lot of innovative development there, across the board. You see it for steel, for example, one of the sort of highest sort of emitters. You see it for various steps of the battery value chain, and even high-tech materials, powder metallurgy, direct metal sort of production, without chemical or pyrometallurgical sort of routes. So that's coming, but I don't expect any of it to be really disruptive in the very short term.
What I would say is that technology that's changing is what's going to be dominant. It's kind of like VHS versus Betamax back in the day. Which one was going to win? And I do think that there's going to be a lot of different battery chemistries. There's going to be horses for courses in terms of batteries. But the largest electric vehicle market in the world is China. And over 50% of their sales are LFP. And increasingly, they're using, with Tesla, something called LMFP. They're adding manganese to the LFP formulation. It's a cheaper car made with more reasonably available material, cheaper, reasonably lithium, iron, and phosphate with some manganese in it. And I think that you're going to see, it's just a better value car for the value market. And so I think LFP is going to be at least 50% LMFP is going to be 50% of the global electric vehicle market, in my personal opinion. Also, when it comes to grid scale batteries, sodium ion is really looking like it's going to be dominant, also made with a cheaper material for grid scale storage. And you'll see some other technologies like something called a zinc air battery could be quite interesting. I quite like, there's a misnomer in the green steel market. Everyone thinks it's steel made with hydrogen. Steel doesn't get made with hydrogen particularly easily. Hydrogen is still, there are a lot of issues with hydrogen. Whereas if you put vanadium and you reinforce steel with vanadium, the way the Chinese have been doing for the last 10 years, you can knock the carbon footprint off because you need 30% less steel in vanadium reinforced steel. So a 70% width does the same job as a 100% width of regular steel if it's reinforced with vanadium, which knocks off 30% of the carbon footprint. Therefore, it's a greener steel. So I think you're going to see a lot of materials science and battery technologies geared towards cheaper materials that have sort of, I don't even know if it's new technology, it's just a new way of looking at practical, smart evolutions.
In my opinion, the batteries aren't going to change anytime soon. Lithium iron phosphate and NMC is what we're going to have. LFMP, they don't have big plans, even in China, for LMFP.
We've seen some decent.
Yeah, but it's still going to be lithium ion based. We've had the same batteries for 40 years. They're throwing everything at it. So for large scale commercial, so the big factor when I talk to mining companies, we're going to invest in a nickel pit, but we're reading next week there's new chemistry coming and nickel's not in it. But realistically, they'll never be able to remove NMC from the chain or LFP. Still, NMC is the dominant battery outside China.
Look, NMC has a big role to play, but we're talking about slowly but surely, up to 2050, taking the mix of 7 to 10% electric vehicle sales up to like 50, right? That's still a huge role. So even if it's 50-50 NMC, that's still 5 times more electric batteries and materials that we need for all of it. The question is, can we produce enough nickel for 50% of the market to be NMC batteries? I'm not sure we can.
But the thing on sodium, sodium's another hype train. So China produced 600 kilowatts of sodium batteries last month. That's 10 EV packs. I mean, there's nothing happening in sodium there. Because the price of lithium crashed. So these, you all know the metals markets, but depends on the price of materials. Now sodium's not being too much discussed because lithium is in a sweet spot for the Chinese. But I agree with you. It does make sense for energy storage, but you have to build a whole new supply chain for that.
Yep.
There's not a sodium cathode material of choice. There's no electrolyte. They don't really know even how does sodium intercalate into the hard carbon. Is it a physical? What kind of reaction? There's a lot unknowns about sodium.
I feel like this conversation could keep going for another hour or two, but I do have to cut us off because we're at time. I want to thank my panelists for making my job so easy today. I didn't have to say a word. You guys just went with it. So that was really insightful. And thank you for joining, and thanks for the questions from the audience. I'm sure our panelists will be around for a little bit longer if you want to continue the discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.